Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at The Wall Street Journal, and distinguished fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. In a desolate stretch of desert spanning West Texas and New Mexico, drillers are pumping more crude than the entire nation of Kuwait. The oil production is so frenzied that huge swaths of land are literally sinking and heaving. The land has subsided by as much as 11 inches since 2015 in a prime portion of the Permian Basin as drillers extract huge amounts of oil and water, according to a Wall Street Journal analysis. In other areas where drillers dispose of wastewater in underground wells, the land has lifted by as much as 5 inches over the same period. The constant extraction and injection of liquids has wrought complex geological changes, which are raising concerns among local communities long supportive of oil and gas. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, especially if you live in the Permian Basin, it's news. Although you have probably noticed if the land under your house has either fallen by 11 inches or risen by 5. We know that all these forms of, there's no way to generate energy without having some impact on something. And this is a way. I think the biggest news there is that having this energy being produced in the United States means that OPEC and Russia have less control over the world economy. We have to worry less about what people in OPEC and Russia think. I think that's a good thing.
It wasn't that long ago that the Biden administration was considering tapping the Strategic Petroleum Reserve after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, so as, I think, to alleviate energy prices without angering environmentalists by pumping new oil. And yet here we are pumping so much oil, we're changing the surface of the earth. How did we get from green appeasement to drill, baby, drill in one term?
Well, I don't actually think that a lot of this is on public land or places where the federal government has a big role. I think they are doing what they can to slow energy development in other places. But, the world needs energy. And my sense would be that I'm all for developing alternative sources of energy. Nuclear, wind, water, you name it, hydrogen, it's all good stuff. We need energy. We're going to need more. But you know what? It wouldn't be bad for the government to say we want ultimately an end to fossil fuels, and we would like the last barrel of oil produced to come from the United States. You could actually have both of those as goals.
All right, our second story. Israeli officials increasingly believe that the International Criminal Court is preparing to issue arrest warrants for senior government officials on charges related to the conflict with Hamas. Israeli and foreign officials also believe the court is weighing arrest warrants for leaders from Hamas, but if the court proceeds, the Israeli officials could potentially be accused of preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip and pursuing an excessively harsh response to the Hamas-led October 7th attacks on Israel. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, news, the International Criminal Court is trying to extend its jurisdiction. Well, that's what courts do. And this court would like nothing more than to sort of be the court of final appeal for anything, anywhere on earth. I think it would be a mistake to indict the Israeli officials unless there's something, that's really far above and beyond what we've seen. There's this dream out there that somehow we're going to be able to regulate war and make war not so bad. Well, first of all, if you made it not so bad, we might have more of them. But also, war has been the whole idea of being able to seal off the civilian side from the horrors of war. It's there's nothing more human than wanting to do that. And nothing more moral in a certain sense than the aspiration. But everything we've seen in the last 150 years has actually been, or even 200, has been to kind of gradually erode the distinction between civilian and military. So, the 19th century, 18th century, Frederick the Great goes to war with Maria Theresa over Silesia. The peasants of Silesia really don't care who wins and aren't thinking about it. All they hope is the armies will stay away. No matter who wins, they're going to have to pay taxes. no matter who wins, there's still going to be peasants. And so war was fought in those days, typically by rather small professional armies. And and they were called cabinet wars. That is, they weren't like a movement of people. It wasn't the people of Silesia rising up against their oppressors. It was two groups of oppressors seeing who was going to get Silesia. And in those circumstances, you really can make a big distinction. You can say, well, we're not going to go back to the 30 years war slaughtering whole civilian populations. There are rules to this thing. And as war became more violent in the 19th and 20th century, as technology advanced, it made a certain amount of sense to want to, the more horrible it was, the more you wanted to restrict it. But I note that actually the steady progress of war during all of this time is to involve civilians much more directly. It's partly with the Industrial Revolution, the concentration of people in cities. Those cities that are producing arms, they're producing the tools of war. So you want to destroy the factories or destroy the railroad bridges that bring the raw materials for the factories and also the food for the civilians into the urban areas. And in World War II, of course, destroying civilian morale was key. It was seen that the morale of the Japanese and the Germans, or for that matter, the Russians, was what was keeping them in the war. And so you wanted to break that. Wars of nations, like the wars between the Azeris and the Armenians, or the wars in post-communist Yugoslavia, inevitably aren't just wars of cabinet wars of a few professional soldiers. They involve whole populations. It's ugly, it is horrifying, but here we are. And I look, for example, if you have kids and they're up in their room, on their computers at night, that computer's in international space. There might whether it's on TikTok and the Chinese are developing information on your kid, or just simply hackers or websites, whatever, your phone and your computer are no longer in a safe civilian space. They're actually in this international space that is controlled by, in a sense, the laws of the jungle. So what we're seeing is, despite the good efforts of people who wish we could somehow erect a space, the realities of international life are sort of irresistibly pulling civilian life into, if there's cyber attacks, what are they going to be on? They're going to be on civilian infrastructure. They're going to be on the banking system, all of this stuff. So what's nuclear deterrence ultimately, but holding hundreds of millions of people as hostages one way or another? So I think we need to probably try to think less about how do we fine-tune war, and more how do we keep war from happening, is probably, if you really do care about the well-being of civilians, I think that's the way we need to go. So something like the ICC, it's well-intentioned and it certainly has its uses, but to try to make it a frontline instrument is probably not a good idea, or not a workable idea in the end.
All right, final story of the week. The drip of the financial industry's exit from New York and California has been measured anecdotally, one at a time, these past few years. Elliott Management decamped to West Palm Beach, Alliance Bernstein to Nashville, Charles Schwab moved to suburban Dallas. But now, for the first time, there are hard numbers quantifying the exact scope of the exodus. Both states, New York and California, have in the past 3 years lost firms that managed close to $1 trillion in assets, according to an analysis by Bloomberg News of 17,000 firms since the end of 2019. The exodus from the Northeast and West Coast has meant the loss of thousands of high-paying jobs, straining city and state finances by sapping tax revenue. Commercial property markets have also lost valuable tenants at the same time they've been struggling with the new realities of hybrid work. Walter, I'm confident this one pushes all the right buttons for you, but is it news or faux news?
That's news. It's news. It's slow-moving news, in the way that big social changes often are. It is to some degree a consequence of the Trump changes to the tax code, changes I bitterly regret every time I pay my District of Columbia taxes, where up until the Trump administration, you could write off the cost of your state and local income taxes and other taxes against on your federal income. Now that's not legal anymore. And so for people in higher income brackets, it almost effectively doubles the cost of state and local taxes. And as a result, a lot of people are moving. In some ways, we might be better off as a society if people stayed and fought and said, we got to do something about these tax levels. But obviously, it is cheaper to flee City Hall than to fight City Hall, and that's what people are doing.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. So, as Secretary of State Antony Blinken is barnstorming the Middle East to develop plans for a ceasefire in Gaza, and pro-Hamas protests and encampments on college campuses are dominating headlines at home, you wrote in your column this week, Walter, that, quote, President Biden is caught between the demands of American national interests during a global crisis and the demands of a vocal and visible part of his political coalition in the run-up to a close election. Let's start by talking about the second horn of that dilemma. How or why does Middle East policy threaten to split the Democratic coalition at this point? I mean, you sometimes think, okay, there's some very lost and disturbed professors and students in like New England and California who see Hamas as a progressive movement for queer rights or whatever. But like these people aren't even a majority on their own campuses. This can't possibly be considered an entire wing of the Democratic Party, which represents, some 80 million voters. But I guess tell us why that's wrong.
Well, you look at the polls, and the war in Gaza seems to be the single issue that President Biden has the lowest approval rating for. And honestly, there's a lot of competition for that title. I forget, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think about 28% of the population overall approves of his Gaza policy. And he's an 81% disapproval rating among voters under 35 for his Gaza policy. Those are bad numbers. And probably some of those people are people who wish he'd do more for Israel. Why don't you stand up more for Israel? So it's not a simple thing, but it is significant, I think. And he's also, you do have this problem. It's not just anti-Israel feeling. And this, I think, is important to understand that what powers a lot of it and what takes it beyond the sort of campus lefty movement into, we have a lot of first, second generation immigrants from the Middle East. And the thing that they hate about Biden policy in the Middle East isn't just he's so too supportive of Israel. It's that we're hand in glove with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other kind of authoritarian governments in the Middle East. And this is, if you're somebody who really was incredible, the Arab Spring was this wonderful golden moment, and you want to see the promise of Arab democracy realized, what you see is that U.S. is tightening its links with exactly the people who are crushing any immediate prospect of democracy or even liberalization in a lot of the Arab world. So this is just a nightmare. And it would be one thing if you thought, well, I'm sorry we're doing it, but I value the end is good enough so that if I can't fully forgive the means, I can live with the means. But if the end is to support Israel and you don't like that, and the means are to strengthen Arab authoritarian governments, this is a real issue. So not only do you find people in Michigan and Dearborn and so on feeling this way, but there's a significant stratum of people out there who believe in Arab democracy, want to see it happen, and see Biden as undercutting his entire authoritarian versus democratic framing for his entire foreign policy.
Can you explain to our listeners a little bit, and you wrote about this or you mentioned it a bit in the column, but how kind of supporters of Arab democracy became not quite synonymous, but maybe aligned in certain ways with the Muslim Brotherhood in particular? What is that movement, and how did it come to be seen as kind of the legitimate alternative to the Gulf monarchies and such?
Well, I mean, look, the Muslim Brotherhood, they were actually when we had the revolution in Egypt that drove out Hosni Mubarak, and you had a free election for the Egyptian president, and Morsi won. This was the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a about 100-year-old movement that has many different takes many different forms. Hamas is one member of this organization, and it sort of has seen itself as standing for moderate Islamism, a bit like, say, the Christian Democrats in Europe after World War II, Muslim Democrats, so to speak. And this was in the early years of Erdogan's rule in Turkey. This group, said, look, we believe, you can have a majority that wants to have Islam respected in the public square, its moral feelings accord with Sharia law in many cases. And so letting the state, having a public opinion that supports an Islamicization of the state, of a secular state, it's not really the worst thing in the world. And it can be, unlike groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, it's both a bit more, significantly more moderate in its view of what Islamization means, and it is much more open to democracy as something that Islamic principles endorse. So certainly during the War on Terror, there were a lot of people in the United States and in the American government, American foreign policy world, who said, well, the Muslim Brotherhood and the moderate Islamists, they can be like the Social Democrats were during the Cold War. Like they take what is good and aspirational out of the socialist tradition, but they get away from the totalitarian violence and horror of Bolshevism. And so this could be a pillar of American foreign policy, and we should be making our peace with this. Now that, I think, and that in President Obama's administration, that was very much something that, particularly in the earlier years, people saw. And when the Arab Spring came along, this really seemed like the vindication of that vision. The fact that first the Arab Spring failed, and that these groups, by and large, were not. I think Tunisia was the last holdout, but is now sort of gone back to something much more like we saw before the Arab Spring. There's been a bit of a radicalization among, Muslim brothers. It looked at, this path. We tried the path of democracy, compromise, pluralism, and, we're either in exile or we're in jails in Egypt. This is not good. This did not work. So, and then the Americans, who seem briefly to be open to this kind of deep reform, went back so quickly to supporting Sisi and so on and so forth. It sort of has led to a breach. And now you see the United States again. And by the way, many people, as the Arab Spring failed, many people came to the United States either as refugees or immigrants, just as they did in 1848 when the European revolutions failed. So, and here in this country, and to some degree in Europe, you have the kind of intellectuals in exile of this who are thinking hard about how do you build a democratic and Islamic tradition. And I think we have to say, it's kind of, dispassionate friends of humanity. This is a good tradition to work on. This is positive stuff. But the fact is that American policy, driven by the need to fight Iran and prevent Iran from sort of putting its own stamp on the region, has ended up forcing the Biden administration to do something that at the beginning it really did not want to do. and that is get in much tighter with these dictatorships or authoritarian regimes. They're not all formal dictatorships in any way. Now, that's where we're getting sort of a lot of people in the kind of intellectual space, public policy space, professors in universities who do in fact represent some of the most positive trends in the Middle East, and who are in the same way that Catholics in the United States sort of thought their way through to a more open, politically and culturally open kind of Catholicism. Clearly, this is a really good thing. But now you've got Hamas, which is at one level part of the Muslim Brotherhood movement and has participated in elections, and yet has been, feels itself to be completely blocked with its political and cultural aspirations. Well, many of these other Muslim Brotherhood or democratic Islamist groups now feel much more blocked. A path that looked open in 2012 does not look open in 2024. And so do you give up all of your aspirations, or do you become more militant? And then when we look on top of that at the highly publicized and very visible and very severe suffering of civilians in the terrible war in Gaza, I think you can see why this has become such a, driving emotional, political, and intellectual force in a group that is not necessarily of itself easily radicalized. But here we are.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. I'm flying to Paris tomorrow, Walter, on a reporting trip. You've spent more time there than I have, I'm sure. So tell me, what are your non-obvious, can't-miss Paris travel tips?
Well, one thing I would say for you, knowing that as you go to Paris, you are leaving a wife with two very young children at home, Jeremy, I would suggest that for you, travel tips might involve stops at places like the Hermes store, where you should be looking at some, appropriate ways to indicate, the value that you attach to your relationship with the mother of your children.
Well, now I won't even get credit for the gifts I bring home. Now that'll go to you.
As well as the credit should, But but that's personal to you. More generically, although this one, there are some great day trips. A lot of Paris, we all sort of know the big places to go. I would say going out to Compiègne on a little, it's a couple hours out of the city. This is where you can go see the railroad car where the Germans surrendered in 1918, and then Hitler made the French surrender rather viciously in 1940. This French restored the pre-1940 thing, and it's this wonderful picture of World War I as seen through French eyes, which is basically the story of how France, with a little bit of help, a small amount of help from not very helpful allies, was able to resist the German aggression and save the world. But it's lovely. It's a lovely town. Napoleon III had a wonderful hunting lodge there, and it's where Joan of Arc was captured by the British. So that's kind of a fun thing to do. In or very close to Paris, my top suggestion would be the Marché de Clignancourt, the giant Paris flea market, which is probably the most fun antique shop in the world. Antique/junk shop, because it's a mix. It's a mix. I know I went there with my mother and her oldest granddaughter when she was about 15, and my mother was well up there. Terrible arthritis, caused her enormous pain. She could hardly see through her eyes. She wore us both out in her determination. The stuff there was just so interesting and so compelling. It was dragged through the entire market because she was sure that right in the next store was the thing that she most wanted. It's really a great place to go. Just a lot of fun, and you never know what you're going to find.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.